Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. During Thursday's Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels, top EU officials were presented with an unexpected curveball in the form of unofficial reports of a new peace initiative hammered out by the US and Russia, and notably with no involvement from either Ukraine or the European Union. Although still unconfirmed, the alleged scheme would build a new and controversial legal framework to end hostilities. But what will be Europe's response if the reports prove to be true? Also, we'll delve into how the European Union wants to counter Russian hybrid threats after the attempted trail derailment in Poland last weekend. Joining us here today is Andrew Tettenborn, law professor at the Swansea University. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good morning.
So let's begin with the response to hybrid warfare. Now, the European Union hasn't been facing this challenge since last weekend, obviously. It has been around for a while. But now we're seeing the first statements. We've had Kaja Kallas saying that this is an unprecedented threat. She also said that the attacks were getting increasingly brazen. But beyond these statements, what would you say would be the best legal response to this challenge?
There's very little you can do in terms of a strict legal response. There's no doubt that what Russia is doing is contrary to international law. But in the end, when you have attacks of this sort, I think the only response is a firm response by way of force, by way of arrests of those involved, and by way of firm action from Brussels. Clearly, there can be complaints at the United Nations. Clearly, in terms of legal response, you could have, I suppose, a claim in an international court. You could equally have sanctions on Russia. But what matters is whether Europe shows unity and an ability to counter this threat on the ground.
So sanctions was actually something that Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski mentioned. He said, I have high hopes for the 20th package. Would you say that these sanctions will prove effective, though? I mean, I've read comments that European sanctions have a problem of enforceability. When the US imposed sanctions on the Rosneft and Lukoil, well, that actually caused quite a stir in Moscow because these sanctions have a wider reach. Why are the European sanctions often considered to be sometimes problematic in terms of, Russia being able to go around them?
I think one point is that Europe has less clout than the United States globally in terms of money and in terms of military, and that actually shows through as regards sanctions. The other point is the quite cynical one, that Europe, even today, still has a much greater dependence on at least some production of Russian hydrocarbons. There are countries in Europe to which you cannot ship oil and gas with any degree of ease. It's much more difficult for Europe to cut itself off from Russia than it is for the United States to do so.
Well, Europe has actually agreed to phase out Russian energy imports. But we also do have another thing.
Phasing out takes time.
Yeah, obviously it does.
Phasing out takes time. That's your problem.
What would you say about the designation of Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism? Now, this term has been coined recently, but there is a legal difference, again, between the US and Europe. In the US, this actually means much more than it does within the European legal framework, doesn't it?
Well, there's no specific international law meaning, as far as I know, about designating a state an international supporter of terrorism. What it tends to be used as is as a prop for further measures against that state. We may be moved towards regarding Russia as an international sponsor of terrorism in the way that we used to regard Libya and I think still regard Iran as such a sponsor. But again, the real question is not the words that we use, but the actions that we take. And the amount of unity that we show in the face of Russian aggression. That will have much more effect on Putin and the hard men in Moscow.
Speaking of which, there have now been reports, and they are getting more and more detailed, about the alleged peace plan. Now, that obviously raises the question of whether this is going to work. Without going into any details, what would you say makes a good peace agreement which can be enforceable in terms of international law? I mean, we've had a peace agreement in Ukraine. We had the Minsk agreements. They didn't work. And also the Budapest Memorandum, again, proved to be a failure. What would you say would be necessary to make a more foolproof deal that would essentially pass the test of time?
Well, as regards whether a peace deal is good in international law, any peace deal is good in international law. The question is whether you can make sure that it is observed. I think the real difficulty with this peace deal is not only that it involves the giving up of territory, which is entirely unacceptable to Ukraine, but it effectively involves the emasculation of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. If you look at the document that was published in, I think it was Axios.
It was, yes.
Okay, we have a statement of a security guarantee, but when you look at it, it also contains an agreement that there shall be no foreign troops allowed in Ukraine, that Ukraine is not to be allowed any missiles that can reach Russia, that the size of Ukraine's army is to be limited. There's also actually one slightly problematic feature of the agreement, which might raise eyebrows at the United Nations. I don't know if you noticed, but there is meant to be an amnesty for all war crimes committed by, well, Ukraine, but also by Russia. Now, that, I think, is an agreement essentially for capitulation. As a matter of international law, except for the amnesty for war crimes, legally, I suppose it is binding, but the only way of making sure that international law is observed in the end is by making sure that the person who breaks it will meet a force that he can't that he can't get over.
So now we obviously need to emphasize this still has not been officially confirmed. So for the time being, these are press reports and speculations. However, you're completely right to mention the question of territorial integrity. Would that stand in terms of international law? I mean, this essentially would have Russia take over control of these territories. The US would recognize them. And from what we know, it appears that in theory that would still be Ukrainian territory, but it would be held by Russia de facto, or perhaps with some sort of remuneration to be paid, as if it was leased by Russia. Do you think that this is actually sustainable in terms of what we've seen in international law so far in different military conflicts and territorial disputes?
I don't think it's likely to be sustainable. This is merely meant as a sop to Ukrainian sensibilities. And my own view is that if Volodymyr Zelensky has any sense, he will have nothing to do with it. It involves de facto Russian control over large territories in his country. I think actually we have to move on now. If we assume that this proposal from the United States actually was made, and very interestingly, nobody has denied it, I think the real question is how far Europe can put pressure to make sure that Ukraine is not forced to accede to it. And that there may be some hope there. One point you do have to remember is that Donald Trump is obviously highly unpredictable, but he's also very much a master of the art of the deal. Now, if Donald Trump discovers that Europe is united against the deal and that Zelensky is prepared to say no, then I think, like any experienced deal maker, he will be forced to think again. And you have to remember one thing, that Trump is also extraordinarily vain and desperately wishes to be remembered as the architect of a successful peace deal. If he thinks that this is not on the cards, then I think we might possibly see a change in US policy.
So now, you've mentioned the European Union and the question of how the European Union is going to react. We do have a statement from Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who emphasized that right now Europe is footing the bill. So essentially Europe is paying more for Ukrainian security than the US does. And yet, according to what we know about this plan, it would actually call for some of the frozen Russian assets to be released, 100 billion to be used for an investment program to rebuild Ukraine. But also, there is a mention that Europe will add an additional 100 billion US dollars. It appears that this was included without consulting Europe, and it is not clear whether that would come from the frozen Russian assets. The wording suggests that it would not. How should Europe react to this? Because essentially this is imposing obligations upon a third party without consulting that party.
Oh, it is. I think Europe should reject this idea almost out of hand. If you look behind the scenes, this is effectively just a suggestion that as far as possible, we use money to solve the problem. And indeed money which would very much benefit the United States and United States corporations were it to be invested in what's left of Ukraine. I think on this, Europe has to stand up. I very much admire what's been said by Radosław Sikorski, and for the moment, Kaja Kallas has made absolutely the right noises. What I think the European Union now has to do, and I think it should probably do it in consultation with other European countries such as Britain, is present a united front saying that it will now immediately provide aid to Ukraine, provide loans to Ukraine, provide arms to Ukraine. But in particular, Europe, I think, must act in a united way in this respect. So far, there have been problems. There have been difficulties with loans to Ukraine. Belgium, for example, has been very worried that the Russians might engage in retaliation against Belgian companies. There are problems with French aid as regards arms. I do think that Europe now needs very much to sit down and get together and make clear to the United States that if the United States is not prepared to support Ukraine, Europe is. Apart from anything else, that might concentrate Donald Trump's mind.
Professor Andrew Tettenborn was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and, as always, for sharing your insight.
My pleasure.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news and updates.